The last time oil prices crossed $120 a barrel was during the chaos of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and the world scrambled to replace Russian energy. That spike lasted a few months before markets adjusted. This time is different. Since Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in March 2026, the price of Brent crude has stayed above $120 for 5 consecutive months. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest since the 1973 embargo, the largest ever. And the country that triggered it wasn't Iran, it was the United States. That's the thing nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. The decision to launch Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026, didn't just start a war with Iran, it detonated a crisis that spread across the global economy within weeks, hitting allies harder than America itself, reshaping relationships that took decades to build, and forcing governments on every continent to ask a question they'd avoided for years. Can America still be trusted? Start with the numbers, because the numbers don't lie. Europe is growing at 0.5% in 2026. Before the war, the IMF projected 1.8%. China has fallen below 3% growth. A figure for Beijing is essentially a recession. Japan's trade deficit has exploded because nearly 90% of its oil imports transit through Hormuz. South Korea, same story. India, which was supposed to be the world's fastest-growing major economy this year, has seen its manufacturing sector contract for the first time since the pandemic. And the fertilizer crisis that started the moment Hormuz closed is now feeding into something worse. Around 30% of global fertilizer supply transits through the strait. When that stopped moving, prices of wheat, corn, and rice started climbing. The Food and Agriculture Organization warned in June that up to 40 countries face acute food insecurity by the end of 2026 if the strait doesn't reopen. None of this happened because of a natural disaster. None of it happened because of a market failure or a pandemic or a drought. It happened because the United States decided to go to war and didn't anticipate that Iran would close the strait and hold it. That's not bad luck. That's a failure of strategic planning at the highest level. Now look at what this has done to America's position in the Gulf. For decades, the logic of American military presence in the region was straightforward. The U.S. maintains bases, the Gulf states get security guarantees. Everyone benefits. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, they all hosted American troops, bought American weapons, and trusted that if something went wrong, Washington had their back. That logic is now broken. After the Iran war launched, Iran didn't just target American bases, it targeted Gulf infrastructure. Oil facilities, desalination plants were threatened. Houthi forces began attacking Saudi shipping in the Red Sea. The Gulf monarchies found themselves caught between two fires, Iran's retaliation on one side and American escalation on the other, neither of which they had asked for, neither of which they could control. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman called Trump personally to ask him to pause the strikes. Qatar and the UAE made the same request. Think about what that means. The countries that depend most on American protection were calling Washington and saying, "Stop. You're making this worse." Because the American bases in their territory, instead of acting as a deterrent, had become targets. Iranian missiles and drones were hitting those installations repeatedly. Troops were being pushed out. And rather than feeling protected by American military presence, the Gulf states were starting to feel exposed by it. So they started looking elsewhere. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan have been quietly building what analysts are already calling a new regional security framework, independent of Washington. The Gulf states have opened security dialogues with China that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The UAE has accelerated military cooperation agreements with France and the United Kingdom. Qatar is in discussions with Turkey about expanding the existing Turkish military base on its territory. This isn't the Gulf states abandoning America. It's something more calculated than that. It's insurance. They're not replacing the US security umbrella, they're building a second one underneath it so that if Washington does something like this again, they have options. And not shift in posture will outlast this war by decades. Once a country decides it needs to hedge against its primary security partner, that decision doesn't get reversed easily. The trust that was lost in the spring of 2026 will not come back with a peace deal or a new administration. It will take years of consistent, reliable behavior to rebuild. And Washington has shown in the past 5 months that consistency is not something it can guarantee. Washington is now fighting at a peace set by Tehran. Iran took the initiative, designed a strategy to exhaust the United States and frighten its Arab allies into pressuring Washington to de-escalate. And it's working. The New York Times went further. In August, it published a piece titled, "In Iran, the US appears headed for a strategic defeat." The editorial board's assessment, Trump's goals remain unmet. The US military is running short on key armaments. Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs are degraded but not destroyed. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively under Iranian control, and Washington is losing credibility both militarily and diplomatically. That's the New York Times, not a fringe outlet, not an Iranian state broadcaster. 5 months in, Operation Epic Fury has produced none of its stated objectives. The regime didn't fall, the street didn't reopen, the nuclear program wasn't destroyed. American troops have been pushed out of 2 countries. The Pentagon is sending emails asking analysts for creative ideas. The question now isn't whether the plan is falling apart. It clearly is. The question is what the US does next, and whether it has the tools left to do anything at all. Washington is now fighting at a peace set by Tehran. Iran took the initiative, designed a strategy to exhaust the United States and frighten its Arab allies into pressuring Washington to de-escalate. And it's working. The New York Times went further. In August, it published a piece titled, "In Iran, the US appears headed for a strategic defeat." The editorial board's assessment, Trump's goals remain unmet. The US military is running short on key armaments. Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs are degraded but not destroyed. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively under Iranian control, and Washington is losing credibility both militarily and diplomatically. That's the New York Times, not a fringe outlet, not an Iranian state broadcaster. 5 months in, Operation Epic Fury has produced none of its stated objectives. The regime didn't fall, the street didn't reopen, the nuclear program wasn't destroyed. American troops have been pushed out of 2 countries. The Pentagon is sending emails asking analysts for creative ideas. The question now isn't whether the plan is falling apart. It clearly is. The question is what the US does next, and whether it has the tools left to do anything at all. 5 months in, the damage list is long. A global oil shock that nobody planned for. Gulf allies building alternative security arrangements for the first time in decades. Europe drawing a line under transatlantic military dependence. And an Iran that has emerged from this conflict not weakened, but hardened, with a proven playbook for how to resist the most powerful military on Earth. The US didn't just fail to win this war. It changed the world in ways it didn't intend, in directions it can't easily reverse, at a cost that will be paid not in Washington, but everywhere else. That's not a plan gone wrong. That's a disaster. There's a dimension to this disaster that goes beyond economics and alliances. It's about perception. And in geopolitics, perception is often more consequential than reality. For 70 years, the core of American global power has rested on one assumption, held by friends and adversaries alike, that the United States military, when fully deployed, wins. It won in the Gulf in 1991. It toppled the Taliban in weeks in 2001. It dismantled Saddam Hussein's army in 3 weeks in 2003. Whatever came after those initial victories, the occupations, the insurgencies, the messy withdrawals, the opening military phase was always decisive. That assumption is now in question. Iran is not a military superpower. Its GDP is smaller than the Netherlands. Its Air Force flies aircraft that were state-of-the-art in 1979. Its Navy is built around asymmetric warfare, fast boats, mines, missiles, rather than blue water power projection. And yet, 5 months into a war launched by the most powerful military in history, Iran has held the Strait of Hormuz, pushed American troops out of 2 countries, and forced Washington into a position where the Pentagon is literally emailing analysts asking for new ideas. Every government in the world has watched this. China has watched this very carefully. North Korea has watched this. Russia has watched this. The lesson they are all drawing is not that Iran is powerful. The lesson is that a determined adversary with a geographic advantage, cheap weapons, and a willingness to absorb punishment can make American military power expensive, slow, and ultimately inconclusive. That's the lesson that shows up in the oil price or the IMF growth forecast. It shows up in the calculations made in foreign capitals about what America will and won't do, and whether its threats can be taken at face value. And then there's the domestic cost.
Then there's Europe, and this is where the damage goes deepest. Europe watched what happened in the Gulf and drew its own conclusions. Not immediately. There was the usual period of diplomatic statements, condemnations of Iran's closure of the strait, calls for de-escalation, but by May, the tone had changed. European capitals were no longer talking about supporting American strategy in the Middle East. They were talking about protecting European interests from the consequences of American strategy in the Middle East. That's a fundamental shift. The relationship between the United States and Europe after 1945 was built on a simple premise. America provides security, Europe provides the political legitimacy of Allied consensus. It survived Suez in 1956, Vietnam, Iraq in 2003, and dozens of smaller disagreements. What it couldn't survive was an America that launched a war causing a global oil shock, refused to acknowledge it was losing, and dismissed its allies' concerns with a social media post. Several European defense ministers have said publicly, in different ways, the same thing. Europe cannot build its security strategy on the assumption that Washington's decisions will be predictable or rational. That's not a critique of Trump specifically. That's a structural conclusion about American foreign policy that will inform European defense spending, alliance building, and strategic autonomy for the next generation. The EU defense budget has increased by 40% since February. France and Germany have accelerated their joint military development programs. The conversation about a European nuclear deterrent, once considered fringe, is now happening openly in Brussels. None of that goes away when this war ends. The lesson has been learned. Here's the irony that Washington still hasn't fully processed. America itself is not the country most hurt by the oil crisis it created. The United States is the world's largest oil producer. High oil prices actually benefit American energy companies. The US economy has slowed, inflation has risen, but the pain is manageable compared to what Japan, South Korea, Germany, or India are absorbing. America lit the fire and walked away from the heat. Its allies are standing in it. That asymmetry, where the country making the decisions absorbs less of the consequences than the countries living with those decisions, is precisely what has broken the trust. The Gulf states, Europe, and Asia are all paying a price they didn't choose for a war they didn't support, and they're taking note of who put them in that position. The Brookings Institution published an assessment in July that put it simply: the United States went into this war trying to remove a destabilizing regime. It came out having replaced an aging, isolated leadership in Tehran with something more radical, more vengeful, and more convinced than ever that the only guarantee of survival is the ability to hold the global economy hostage through Hormuz. In other words, the war didn't solve the Iran problem, it made it permanent. Trump entered this war with approval ratings that suggested at least a portion of the American public believed the initial premise that a decisive strike against Iran could work. By August, with troops expelled from Kuwait and Bahrain, with the Pentagon running low on missiles, with gas prices elevated and no end in sight, those numbers have shifted. More importantly, the foreign policy establishment, not just Democrats, but Republican foreign policy veterans, retired generals, former ambassadors, has begun saying openly what they were saying privately in March. This war was not planned. The objectives were not achievable through air power alone, and the administration has no clear path to declaring victory and getting out. The New York Times editorial board said the U.S. appears headed for a strategic defeat. The Financial Times said Washington is fighting at a pace set by Tehran. Foreign Policy magazine, hardly a radical outlet, published a piece advising Trump on the diplomatic art of losing well. When your own country's establishment press is teaching you how to lose gracefully, the disaster is complete. There's one question that cuts through all of this, and it's the one that America's allies are now asking in private and increasingly in public. Was this war a choice or was it inevitable? Because if it was inevitable, if Iran's nuclear program had advanced to a point where military action was the only remaining option, then the disaster, as painful as it is, was the price of a necessary decision. History has examples of wars that were economically and diplomatically catastrophic, but strategically necessary. Sometimes the right call is the costly one. But the timing of Operation Epic Fury tells a different story. The strikes were launched on February 28, 2026, in the middle of active negotiations between Iran and the United States over the nuclear program. Iran was at the table. An agreement was not guaranteed, but the diplomatic track had not been exhausted. The decision to strike during negotiations didn't just start a war, it told every government watching that American diplomatic commitments have an expiration date that isn't announced in advance, that when Washington decides the time is right, the conversation ends and the bombs start falling, regardless of what was said the day before. That lesson will be remembered in Pyongyang, where Kim Jong-un has spent years deciding whether a nuclear deal with America is worth the paper it's printed on. It will be remembered in Beijing, where every back-channel communication with Washington comes with an asterisk. It will be remembered in Iran itself, where whatever comes after this war will be shaped by the understanding that American assurances are conditional in ways that are never fully disclosed. The oil price will eventually come down. The Gulf states will eventually find a new equilibrium. Europe will eventually build whatever security architecture it decides it needs. These are recoverable situations. What's harder to recover is the answer to the question now being asked in every capital that has ever relied on American credibility. If this is what America does to a country it's negotiating with, what does it do to its allies?